Glittering mosaics masked a dying empire, where every alliance was sealed not in love, but in blood and betrayal. You stand at the gates of Constantinople in the mid-11th century, staring at a city that appears eternal. The marble walls rise like cliffs against the horizon, taller than any siege tower, wider than rivers of stone. Their surface gleams under the sun, scarred but unbroken, a promise of protection to those within and a threat to those without. From a distance, you might believe this empire is invincible, but step closer and the truth begins to bleed through the cracks. Behind those walls lies a city that glitters like a jewel and rots like a corpse. Constantinople is rich beyond imagining. Gold leaf covers the domes of its churches, incense burns in great cathedrals where choirs echo the chants of centuries, and merchants from every corner of the world hawk silks, spices, and slaves in its markets. And yet, beneath the grandeur, the empire is trembling. Its enemies are gathering, its rulers are faltering, and its survival will soon depend not on armies or strategies, but on the fate of a child. The Byzantine Empire in the 11th century was an empire caught between illusion and reality. Officially, it still claimed the legacy of Rome. Its emperors were addressed as Basileus of the Romans, seated on gilded thrones that once ruled continents. In theory, their power was limitless, but in truth, the empire was a stage play performed over ruins, each act held together with fragile threads of deceit. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. A weak ruler was often strangled in his sleep, blinded in the dungeons, or exiled to a monastery where he would vanish from history. Court officials plotted like assassins in the dark, each alliance as fragile as a candle's flame in the wind. Ambition mattered more than loyalty, suspicion more than trust. The palace itself became a battlefield where poison and whispered conspiracies replaced swords. You can almost hear it, the echo of sandals rushing through the marble corridors at midnight, the hurried whisper of a eunuch delivering news of betrayal, the muffled cries of a deposed emperor dragged into exile. Power here is never safe. It is a throne balanced over a pit. Yet while emperors fought one another, shadows gathered beyond the empire's borders. From the east came the Seljuk Turks, fierce horsemen who rode like thunder across the plains of Anatolia. Their arrows darkened the sky, their conquests shattered cities, and their sultans demanded not only land, but recognition. Byzantium, once the unchallenged power of the Christian world, suddenly faced an enemy it could neither ignore nor easily defeat. To the north, Slavic tribes and ambitious warlords tested the empire's defences. To the south, Arab forces pushed against Byzantine strongholds. Even the Normans, restless warriors from the west, looked hungrily at Byzantine lands. Encircled on every side, Constantinople had only one weapon left: diplomacy. But diplomacy here was not written in treaties or trust. It was written in blood. And so, the empire turned to its oldest, cruelest trick. It offered its daughters. For centuries, Byzantine princesses had been given as pawns to foreign kings, sultans, and even enemies. To marry a Byzantine royal was to receive the empire's blessing, its temporary peace, and its fragile promise of alliance. But behind that promise was the brutal sacrifice of innocence. Children, barely able to read, were promised to men old enough to be their grandfathers. They were traded like coins, wrapped in silk, and delivered as bargaining chips. Imagine it, a little girl swaddled in purple silk, too young to understand the word marriage, too young even to comprehend the world beyond the palace walls. Yet in Sultan, the eyes of courtiers, she was not a child, she was Byzantium's last weapon. This is where our story begins. A child, her name barely remembered in the chronicles, was born in this age of desperate service. Her world was cloaked in splendor. She was swaddled in silks dyed purple, the sacred imperial color, while priests blessed her cradle with incense from the altars of Hagia Sophia. But behind the ritual, behind the gilded palace walls, she was already a prisoner. Every Byzantine child of noble birth was born into expectation, but for her there was no childhood at all. She was not seen as a daughter, not even as a person, but as a bargaining chip. From her earliest years, she lived under the watchful eyes of eunuchs and courtiers, who reminded her with every lesson, every bow, every silence, that she did not belong to herself, she belonged to the empire. The palace in which she was raised shimmered with mosaics and gold leaf, its halls echoing with the chant of priests, its corridors patrolled by silent eunuchs whose loyalty was to the throne, not to the children they guarded. Within those polished marble walls, she was treated as a symbol of continuity, a living seal to be stamped upon treaties yet to be imagined. While the air around her was thick with incense, while hymns rose like smoke through the dome of Hagia Sophia, she was being conditioned into obedience, stripped of innocence long before she understood what it meant. Imagine the psychological weight pressing upon a girl too small even to write her own name, every smile rehearsed, every gesture corrected, every silence praised until she began to forget how to be herself. Other children of her age might have known the comfort of running barefoot on grass, chasing geese in a village courtyard, laughing without consequence. She knew only the heavy velvet of ceremonial garments, the aching stillness of long hours spent motionless before visitors, the correctional pinch of a governess's fingers digging into her shoulder when she shifted her weight or forgot to bow at the precise angle decreed by palace etiquette. Our earliest memories were not of freedom but of ritual, not of warmth but of surveillance. Even her toys were instruments of indoctrination, dolls dressed in stiff brocades, miniature thrones and censers meant to remind her of who she was expected to become, never of who she might wish to be. Her days unfolded with suffocating repetition, the dawn call of bells summoning priests to bless the household, the careful dressing in robes too elaborate for a child, the whispered instructions of eunuchs reminding her when to lower her gaze, when to smile faintly, when to hold her tongue. Her meals were not shared around a family table but observed like ceremonies, every bite and gesture an act of training. In the shadows of the palace, the intrigues of adults swirled endlessly, generals plotting against emperors, nobles whispering betrayals, priests debating doctrine. Yet she absorbed their anxiety, their suspicion, their hunger for control, until even as a child she knew her life was a pawn in a larger game. She learned early that she was not loved for herself but for her bloodline, not cherished as a daughter but calculated as an asset. The women of the court did not cradle her in warmth. They evaluated her with cool eyes, noting her posture, her obedience, her capacity for silence, as one might evaluate the soundness of a horse before sale. By the age of 3, she was scolded for laughing too loudly. By 4, she was praised not for play but for stillness. By 5, she already carried herself with a gravity no child should bear because she understood instinctively that her value lay in her ability to endure. The priests who came to bless her spoke of saints and martyrs, their voices solemn and instructive, but the lessons were never meant to inspire hope. They were warnings. Suffering was her inheritance, sacrifice her destiny, obedience her salvation, and as incense curled through the chambers of the palace, as chants reverberated through its domes, she began to believe them. Step into her world for a moment. Imagine what it meant to live surrounded by marble and gold buoy. The storm broke when she was only 5 years old. By then, Byzantium faced a growing enemy on its eastern frontier, the Seljuk Turks, rising under their formidable sultans. The empire, weary and fractured, sought desperately for peace, and peace demanded a price. At 40 years old, the Sultan was already a man seasoned by war and hardened by ambition. He demanded not land, not wealth, but her. The little girl, scarcely old enough to hold a doll, was to be engaged to him. It was called diplomacy. But it was, in truth, the selling of a child to a man 8 times her age. Imagine the weight of that moment. Palace courtiers whispering the decree as if it were some inevitable fate. Her parents cloaked in silence, unable or unwilling to fight the decision, while the child herself remained too young even to grasp the full horror of what was unfolding. Yet children sense more than adults give them credit for. She would have noticed the tension in the air, the way conversations ended when she entered the room, the strange looks that followed her as she passed, the sudden hush in the palace corridors that once carried the sound of priests chanting blessings. The empire was bleeding and her small body was chosen as the bandage. Behind the closed doors of the Byzantine court, arguments raged. Some advisors urged resistance, better to fight than to humiliate the throne by handing over a child. Others, weary of constant wars, whispered that an alliance through marriage would be the only way to buy survival. In the end, survival outweighed morality. The decision was signed not with ink but with silence, with resignation, with the quiet consent of those too afraid of the Seljuk armies pressing ever closer to Constantinople. And so a child became a bargaining chip. She would never again be seen merely as a daughter. She was now a promise wrapped in silk, an offering to appease an Iene, far older and far more powerful than she could ever comprehend. Picture her on the day she was told, eunuchs approaching her chamber, their faces expressionless, their tone rehearsed as they explained in words far too complex for a 5-year-old to understand that her future was no longer her own. They dressed it in ceremony, cloaking it in the language of honor, but at its core, it was theft, the theft of a childhood, of a future she could have chosen. Her small hands, perhaps clutching a doll, would have trembled as she tried to make sense of phrases like engagement and treaty. The word husband was spoken, but how could she comprehend it? She barely knew what family was, yet now she was told she would belong to a man old enough to be her grandfather. The Sultan on his side saw the arrangement not as a union but as a conquest. To him she was proof that Byzantium had bent the knee, that the empire once feared across the known world was so weakened it would offer up its own daughters to spare itself from destruction. She was not a bride in his eyes, but a trophy. Every time he looked upon her, he would see not the face of a child, but the victory of his power. The Byzantines, masters of rhetoric, dressed the bargain in words of diplomacy. Chroniclers recorded it with cold detachment. The princess was betrothed. But in truth, what was unfolding was far darker. A little girl's innocence was bartered away across negotiating tables lit by candles, her future traded like coin, her name written into documents that spoke of peace but reeked of betrayal. Even the church, which might have raised a cry against such cruelty, stayed silent, for the priest's peace, even at such a cost, was framed as God's will. Her sacrifice, they insisted, would protect the faithful, preserve the empire, and buy time. To them, her tears were not tragedy, but offering, as though her child as owed was incense to be burned for the salvation of Byzantium. Yet the irony was sharp and merciless. Byzantium, desperate to preserve itself, was sacrificing the very thing it was sworn to protect. In a single day, the rhythm of her life shifted. Playtime was erased from her world. Dolls and lullabies were replaced with veils, silence, and lessons in obedience. She was taught to walk with eyes lowered, to speak only when spoken to endure humiliation without protest. The transformation was brutal. Other children her age were running in gardens, chasing butterflies under the Byzantine sun. She sat in darkened chambers, memorizing the rituals of marriage and the gestures of submission. Childhood was stolen not by war, not by plague, but by politics. And the little girl began to vanish into the role forced upon her. Imagine her mornings now, no longer filled with the sounds of laughter, but with the stern voices of tutors drilling her in languages, rituals, and mannerisms she could barely comprehend. The games of hide and seek that once echoed through the palace corridors were replaced with endless drills on how to bow, how to sit, how to smile without appearing too bold. Every mistake, every hesitation was met not with patience but with cold reminders that her future depended on obedience. The dolls she once clutched were taken away and replaced with fabrics, jewels, and ceremonial objects far too heavy for her small hands, each one a symbol of a role she neither chose nor understood. By night, as the palace grew silent, she would curl beneath her covers, whispering to herself the lullabies her mother once sang, trying to cling to fragments of innocence slipping through her fingers. But even sleep offered no refuge. Dreams turned into nightmares of veiled faces, of strangers with harsh eyes, of ceremonies she could not escape. While the empire's courtiers congratulated themselves for securing peace, a child was being unmade piece by piece. The cruelty lay not only in the decision itself, but in its slow erosion of her humanity. Every day stripped away something her laughter, her play, her freedom. The girl was buried alive beneath the weight of expectation, forced to carry a burden far too heavy for her fragile shoulders. Other children stumbled and learned through mistakes. She was not allowed mistakes. Other children cried freely. Her tears were hidden, punished, or ignored. Other children were cherished as sons and daughters. She was treated as a symbol, her worth measured not in love but in political value. The vanishing was not sudden, it was gradual, a slow suffocation of the soul. Her voice grew quieter, her steps more controlled, her eyes dimmer with each passing season. And yet deep within, a flicker of resistance remained, the small, desperate hope of a child who longed to run again in sunlight, who still remembered the warmth of her mother's embrace, who refused, even in silence, to forget she was human. When she was brought to the Sultan's court, it was like stepping into another world. The incense and mosaics of Constantinople gave way to vast courtyards filled with the shadows of armed guards and the suffocating hierarchy of the harem. To the Sultan, she was not a child, she was a trophy, proof that Byzantium would bow before him, even if only in appearances. His gaze saw power, submission, alliance, but never the human heart of the girl before him. The courtyards echoed with languages foreign to her ears, prayers chanted at dawn in tones that felt alien, and rituals designed to remind her that she was no longer Byzantine, no longer herself, but something reshaped to serve another empire's pride. The air smelled of spices she had never known, of oils burning in lamps that illuminated walls adorned with patterns unfamiliar to her eyes. Every sight, every sound, every scent told her she no longer belonged. The harem itself was a labyrinth of silks and secrets, a gilded prison where women maneuvered with calculated precision, each smile concealing rivalry, each whisper hiding betrayal. For a 5-year-old girl, it was an overwhelming ocean of power games, one in which she was expected not just to swim, but to survive. The Sultan, 40 years old and hardened by years of war, regarded her as nothing more than a piece of proof, a living seal stamped onto an alliance. His hand, weathered by battle and heavy with rings, hovered like a constant shadow over her fate. To him, she was leverage, a guarantee that Byzantium's trembling empire would keep its promises. But to her, he was a figure of terror, too vast to comprehend, a man whose presence swallowed all light. Yet within her, two worlds collided. The Byzantine chants of priests still lingered in her memory, holy words rising with incense toward golden domes, while now she was forced to kneel beneath a ruler who prayed differently, who demanded obedience from her very breath. The clash of identities, child of Constantinople, pawn of the Sultan, tore at her soul, pressing her into silence. Her body became the battleground where two empires claimed their victory, while her heart was left unclaimed by anyone. She would sit quietly in chambers filled with cushions too grand for her small frame, her legs barely touching the ground, listening to the footsteps of eunuchs and guards pacing just beyond the latticed doors. In that silence, she began to understand the truth. She was not seen as a child to be protected, but as a currency to be spent. The Sultan's palace shimmered with wealth and ceremony, but beneath its gold was a darkness that grew heavier each day. And so the little girl, once wrapped in purple silks of Byzantium, once kissed by her mother beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia, now lived under the gaze of a man who would never see her as human, only as power made flesh. Inside the palace, cruelty was not only wielded by the Sultan, it trickled downward, poisoning the lives of women in his household. For the little Byzantine girl, this was the most suffocating truth of all. Even among those who should have understood her suffering, there was no safety. The women of the harem, wives, concubines, rivals, saw her not as a child to be pitied, but as a threat wrapped in silks. She was too foreign, too young, too different. They whispered about her in corridors heavy with incense, their voices slicing into her like blades. Some mocked her accent, others her wide, frightened eyes, and still others the fact that she had been given to the Sultan as a diplomatic prize. To them, she was a reminder of their own fragility, proof that every woman in this palace was replaceable, that even a child could be turned into currency. And so, she learned quickly that survival did not depend on innocence, but on silence. A smile, soft and practiced, became her only weapon. Silence became her armor. Every word she swallowed, every thought she buried, shielded her from the jealous rage of those who circled like predators. Her mind, though, remained her hidden sanctuary. When nights grew too heavy and the walls of the harem seemed to close in, she escaped inward. She remembered the taste of honeyed bread carried to her lips by her mother's gentle hands. She replayed the sound of church bells ringing through Constantinople's dawn, mingling with the sea breeze of the Bosporus. She imagined the glowing mosaics of Hagia Sophia, each tile glittering like a shard of heaven. These fragments of home became more than memory, they became her rebellion. The Sultan's gaze weighed upon her, but she learned to bow without breaking. The women's cruelty clawed at her, but she wrapped her heart in silence too deep for them to reach. Even at 5, 6, 7 years old, she was already becoming something far beyond a child. She was a survivor shaped in shadows, a girl who built fortresses not from stone but from memory, yet the cost was devastating. Piece by piece, her innocence was stripped away. She no longer laughed without fear. She no longer cried when beaten down by whispers or stares. Instead, her face became a mask, her soul hidden beneath a veil that no one could penetrate. This was not childhood, it was survival in its purest, cruelest form, and though she endured, the weight of what she carried would echo long after she was gone. For in her silence, she was not just protecting herself, she was preserving the last fragile fragments of Byzantium, held secretly within the heart of a lost princess. Rumours drifted across the empire, slipping like smoke through the cracks of palaces and barracks, carrying with them the faint whisper of her name. In Constantinople, Byzantine envoys still spoke of her in hushed tones, voices heavy with guilt and shame, as though uttering her memory could undo the bargain that had condemned her. Some claimed her family tried to negotiate her return, appealing to the Sultan with promises of tribute, while others whispered of daring plots to smuggle her back across enemy lines, plans that dissolved before they could ever take form. Yet inside the Sultan's palace, resistance was not a sword one could brandish, but a dagger hidden deep within the soul. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave, was a risk, for suspicion prowled in every corridor. She could not cling to Constantinople openly, even her dreams became dangerous, and so her rebellion took on the only form left to her, memory. She remembered who she was, not as the Sultan's possession, not as the frightened child in foreign silks, but as a daughter of Byzantium, a child of purple robes and holy incense, born beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia. In the privacy of her mind, she recited the hymns of her faith, imagined her mother's lullabies, and held tightly to an identity that her captors tried endlessly to strip away. This quiet defiance, invisible to the Sultan and the jealous women around her, became her fire in the darkness. It was not rebellion with armies or treaties, but the stubborn refusal to forget. And in that refusal lay the only freedom she could still claim, the fragile hidden spark of a self the empire had sold, but never fully extinguished. And then she vanishes. The chronicles grow suddenly cold, their voices trailing into silence, as if history itself turned its face away. No record tells us what became of her, no scribe bothered to carve her name into marble to ink her fate into the great annals of Byzantium or the Seljuk court. She is swallowed whole by the shadows of power, leaving us only with fragments of speculation. Did she wither away in the Sultan's palace, her body too small to bear the crushing weight of despair? Did she die young, entombed in a nameless grave, her existence erased before she even learned the fullness of her own language? Or did she endure, forced to live on in a foreign court, her name erased, her voice silenced, her identity ground down until she became unrecognizable even to herself? The sources offer nothing but silence, and that silence is perhaps more damning than any confession. For history is merciless. It preserves treaties, battles, and dynasties, yet discards the lives sacrificed to sustain them. The tears of a child, the tremble of her small hands clutching the veil dragged over her head, the nights she whispered prayers to a god she was forbidden to call upon, all of this left no trace in the records. What remains is absence, a hollow space where a life once struggled, where innocence once fought to breathe. And in that absence, we are confronted with the brutal truth. She was never meant to be remembered, only used, discarded, and forgotten, her silence serving as proof of the cruelty that had consumed her. The tragedy is not only hers. The bargain that devoured her innocence, the engagement that chained a 5-year-old child to a 40-year-old sultan, bought Byzantium nothing. Within a single generation, the Seljuk armies thundered across Anatolia, and at Manzikert in 1071, they shattered the Byzantine forces so completely that the empire never truly recovered. The purple banners of Constantinople, once proud and radiant, fell into tatters as generals quarrelled, emperors turned on one another, and provinces were swallowed like dry leaves in a storm. The princess's sacrifice, her stolen childhood, her life ground into silence, none of it secured the survival her family had hoped to preserve. The empire that sold its daughter for a fleeting illusion of peace was left in ruins, its power broken, its lands carved away piece by piece until it stood like a hollow shell of its former glory. And yet, no chronicle speaks of her as a victim, no monk dared to record her suffering in the margins of the great histories. To them she was simply the bride sent to the Sultan, a line in the cold language of diplomacy. But if we look past the victories and defeats, if we press our ears to the void she left behind, we hear something more haunting, the sound of betrayal echoing across centuries. Byzantium's leaders gambled with a child's soul, and they lost everything. The empire slipped away into darkness, and all that remained was the ghost of a little girl who had been consumed by power's cruelty, her sacrifice rendered meaningless by the endless hunger of conquest. And so she remains, a shadow, a ghost, a lost princess. Her name is not sung in the hymns of Hagia Sophia, nor painted in the luminous mosaics that once dazzled pilgrims from across the world. She is absent from the grand chronicles that detail the rise and fall of emperors, forgotten even by the empire that bartered her in. O sense away, yet her silence is louder than the voices of the powerful who erased her. For when we strip away the pomp of treaties, the careful ink of chroniclers, and the pride of rulers who claimed they acted for survival, what we find is not strategy, it is sacrifice. The sacrifice of a child who never lived long enough to know freedom, to run in gardens without fear, to speak her own name without trembling. She was reduced to a pawn, and yet within her story lies the eternal question: how many empires have been built not on stone, but on the broken bones of children forced into roles they never chose? Her suffering was not unique. It is a thread woven into human history, repeated in castles and courts, in harems and palaces, wherever power devours the powerless. And though her body vanished into the folds of time, her shadow lingers in every forgotten child whose life was traded for ambition. She deserves to be remembered, not as a nameless pawn, but as a voice stolen too soon, a reminder that behind the dazzling myths of empire are real lives, real pain, and innocence consumed by cruelty. The Lost Princess of Byzantium is not simply a tale of one girl, it is a mirror, reflecting humanity's darkest bargains back at us. And as you leave her story tonight, ask yourself, how many names have been lost to silence, and who will remember them if we do not?